The man everyone stopped seeing. The alarm sounded at 4:37 a.m., not loud, not dramatic, just a sharp electronic chirp that echoed through Building C of North River Manufacturing. Within seconds, conveyor belts slowed. Warning lights blinked amber. A half-finished batch of industrial pump houses stopped moving down the assembly line. Workers exchanged tired looks. Some sighed. Others simply kept walking. For most of them, breakdowns had become part of the routine. Outside, cold January rain tapped against the factory's steel walls. Water gathered in shallow puddles near loading docks, where trucks waited beneath dim floodlights. Inside, the air smelled of machine oil, hot metal, and wet concrete. A technician named Luis checked a monitor. Line 3 again. Another worker shook his head. Third time this month. Fourth. No, third. Neither bothered counting anymore, because the real problem wasn't the breakdown. It was that nobody could figure out why it kept happening. The machine would run perfectly for days, then suddenly stop. No obvious warning, no consistent pattern, just failure. And every shutdown cost money. A lot of money. By 7 o'clock that morning, the problem had already reached the newest office in the building, the CEO's office. Ethan Cole stood beside the window, overlooking the factory floor. 31 years old, sharp suit, sharp haircut, sharp opinions. 3 months earlier, investors had celebrated his appointment as the youngest CEO in company history. He had degrees from prestigious universities, experience in technology startups, a reputation for aggressive efficiency, and absolutely no patience for waste. He stared through the glass at the workers below. Rows of machines stretched across the enormous floor like steel rivers. Forklifts moved between stations. Operators adjusted controls. Maintenance crews walked purposefully through narrow aisles. To Ethan, it looked less like a factory and more like a puzzle that had been neglected for too long. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Morning. His operations director, Claire Morgan, entered carrying a tablet. The line is down again. Ethan didn't look surprised. Estimated loss? About $60,000 if we're offline all day. Ethan exhaled. Not angry, just annoyed. The kind of annoyance that came from seeing a problem repeatedly ignored. Let's take a look. 20 minutes later, they were walking through Building C. The noise hit immediately. Compressed air hissing, motors humming, metal clanking against metal. The factory possessed its own rhythm, a language spoken through machinery. Ethan was still learning it. Claire had spoken it for 15 years. As they approached Line 3, engineers clustered around an open control panel. Wires hung loose. Diagnostic screens glowed. Nobody seemed particularly confident. Ethan folded his arms. The lead engineer hesitated. We're still investigating. That's what you said last time. No answer. Ethan's gaze drifted beyond the group, toward an elderly man standing several yards away. The man wore faded coveralls. Gray hair peeked from beneath a worn cap. His shoulders were slightly bent with age. One hand rested lightly against the machine housing. Not working, not repairing, just listening. At least that's what it looked like. Ethan frowned. Who's that? Claire followed his gaze. Walter Briggs. What does he do? Maintenance. Ethan raised an eyebrow. 40+ years. The answer surprised him. Walter certainly looked old enough. But what surprised Ethan more was that nobody seemed concerned about his presence. Workers passed him naturally, as if he were part of the building itself. Like a pipe, or a support beam. Something that had always been there. Walter slowly removed his hand from the machine. Then he turned toward a nearby technician. Did the vibration start before or after the temperature change? The technician blinked. What? Walter repeated the question, calmly, patiently. The younger man shrugged. I don't know. Walter nodded once, then walked away. That was it. No explanation. No advice. Nothing. Ethan looked at Claire. Does he always do that? Do what? Act like some kind of machine whisperer? A faint smile appeared on her face. Something like that. Ethan wasn't amused. To him, the exchange looked ridiculous. The factory was bleeding money. Engineers needed data, not riddles. They continued the inspection. But throughout the morning, Ethan kept noticing Walter, near the welding area, then beside the hydraulic systems, then in a maintenance corridor. Never rushing, never talking much, always watching, listening, observing. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. Around noon, a management meeting assembled in the conference room. Charts filled the screen. Production targets, operating costs, repair budgets, loss projections, the usual concerns. Halfway through the discussion, the conversation returned to line 3, again. Ethan rubbed his temples. We're spending millions on upgrades this year. Heads nodded, and yet we're still relying on guesswork. Nobody spoke. His frustration finally surfaced. Maybe part of the problem is that we're holding on to outdated systems. The room remained quiet. Ethan continued. Machines age. He paused. Processes age. His eyes drifted briefly toward the factory floor visible through the glass wall. So do employees. The comment wasn't directed at anyone specifically, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. Claire shifted slightly in her chair. Not enough to challenge him. Just enough to register discomfort. Ethan didn't notice, or perhaps he chose not to, because from his perspective, the issue seemed obvious. Modern companies evolved, adapted, improved. Sentimentality had no place in efficiency. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Outside, rain continued falling. Dark clouds pressed low over the industrial district. As evening approached, workers clocked out. Others arrived for night shift. The factory never truly slept. It only changed faces. Near the end of his shift, Walter walked alone through Building C. Most lights had dimmed. Only operational sections remained fully illuminated. He stopped beside line 3, the troubled machine. For several moments he stood silently, listening. A faint vibration traveled through the steel frame, barely noticeable, almost invisible. But it was there. Walter frowned, not with confusion, with recognition. Like someone hearing a familiar voice after many years. His weathered fingers touched the machine housing. The vibration continued, slow, uneven, wrong. Across the factory, workers prepared for another routine night. Nobody noticed Walter standing there. Nobody asked what he was hearing. Nobody realized the expression on his face. Because if they had, they might have understood what was coming. At 11:14 p.m., the entire production line failed. And by sunrise, security footage would reveal something that left even the engineers struggling to explain. 12 hours before the catastrophic shutdown, the old maintenance worker, everyone had stopped seeing, had already known exactly where it would happen. The blueprints in the locker. The shutdown lasted 36 hours. For North River Manufacturing, that wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a wound. By Monday morning, production schedules were behind. Delivery deadlines had been pushed. Customers were demanding answers. Investors wanted conference calls. And every hour the machines remained silent, the cost grew heavier. The factory felt different now. Not physically, emotionally. The usual rhythm had been interrupted. Workers spoke in lower voices. Supervisors checked their phones more often. Engineers carried an exhausted look that came from chasing a problem they still didn't fully understand. From his office window, Ethan Cole watched crews dismantle sections of Line 3. The machine sat open like a patient on an operating table. Panels removed, components exposed, cables hanging loose. The failure had occurred precisely where the security footage showed Walter standing the night before. The exact location, the exact section, the exact problem. Ethan still didn't know what bothered him more, that Walter had predicted it, or that nobody seemed particularly surprised. A knock came at his door. Claire entered carrying a folder. Maintenance report. Ethan accepted it. Anything useful? Not much, she hesitated. Though the engineers have been talking. About Walter? Claire nodded. Ethan leaned back. What exactly is his story? A faint smile appeared. If you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers. Try me. Claire looked toward the factory floor. Some say he helped design half this place. Ethan laughed. She didn't. The laughter faded. You're serious. I said some people believe it. Do you? Claire took a moment before answering. I think there are things about this company that happened before either of us arrived. That wasn't an answer, but it was enough to keep the question alive. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to do something he rarely did. He left his office without an agenda. No meeting, no inspection, no schedule, just questions. The factory looked different when viewed from the floor instead of above. The sounds felt larger. The machinery felt older. The people felt more real. Near the welding stations, he stopped beside a veteran employee named Harold. Harold had worked there nearly 30 years. If anyone knew company history, it would be him. Ethan nodded toward Walter, who was crossing the far end of the building. How long has he been here? Harold followed his gaze. Longer than me. Doing maintenance? Harold chuckled. That's what they call it now. What does that mean? The older worker scratched his beard. Back in the day, if something broke and nobody knew why, they called Walter. Because he was the best mechanic? Harold considered that. Not exactly. Then why? Because half the time he understood the machine better than the people who built it. Before Ethan could ask another question, Harold returned to work, leaving behind more mystery than answers. That evening, Ethan requested personnel records. Human resources sent everything they could find. The file seemed strangely thin, far too thin. 40 years of employment should have filled multiple folders. Instead, large sections were missing. Promotions weren't documented. Transfers appeared incomplete. Entire years seemed absent. Ethan frowned. How does that even happen? The HR manager sighed. Mergers. North River had changed ownership 3 times over the decades. Paper records had been moved, digitized, lost, archived, forgotten. History had been scattered across generations of management. Most people never cared enough to reconstruct it. Until now. Ethan spent another hour digging through old databases, then another and another. Near midnight, he found something. Not in the personnel records, in engineering archives. A faded project document from 26 years earlier. The scanned image was difficult to read. Coffee stains covered one corner. Several signatures appeared at the bottom. One signature caught his attention. Walter Briggs, not listed as maintenance, not listed as technician. The document identified him as Mechanical Systems Development Team. Ethan sat upright. Development team? That wasn't possible. Or perhaps it was, and nobody had bothered to remember. The next day brought another discovery. One of the oldest storage buildings on company property was scheduled for cleanup. Unused equipment, broken furniture, outdated files, decades of accumulated clutter. Ethan joined the inspection personally. The building smelled of dust and cold metal. Sunlight entered through grimy windows. Floating particles drifted through the air. Near the back wall stood a row of rusted employee lockers. Most hung open, empty, forgotten. One remained locked. The identification plate was faded, almost unreadable. But a name could still be seen. Walter Briggs. Ethan stared at it. The locker looked untouched for years, maybe decades. Can we open it? The maintenance supervisor shrugged. Technically, it's company property. 10 minutes later, the lock was removed. The metal door creaked open. Inside was no treasure, no secret fortune, nothing dramatic, just notebooks, dozens of them, stacked neatly, protected inside plastic covers. Ethan removed one carefully. The pages were filled with sketches, measurements, calculations, machine designs, annotations written in precise handwriting. Another notebook contained redesigned hydraulic systems. Another documented production improvements. Another described solutions to failures that had occurred years before Ethan ever joined the company. The deeper he looked, the more astonishing it became. These weren't maintenance notes. They were engineering blueprints. Original engineering work. Hours passed. The pile seemed endless, and every notebook carried the same name, Walter Briggs. That evening, Ethan sat alone in his office. The rain had finally stopped. For the first time in days, sunlight broke through the clouds. Orange light stretched across the factory floor below. Workers moved between stations. Machines hummed. Life continued. But Ethan no longer saw the building the same way. The old worker he'd dismissed as outdated now appeared woven into the company's history, not as an employee, as an architect of its survival. Yet one question remained unanswered. If Walter had contributed so much, why wasn't he celebrated? Why wasn't he an executive? Why wasn't his name attached to patents, departments, or awards? Why had he spent years changing filters, repairing motors, and walking factory floors as though none of it mattered? The answer arrived unexpectedly, just before sunset. Ethan found an old company photograph hanging in a neglected hallway. The frame was dusty. Most employees walked past it without noticing. In the picture stood a younger Walter, straight-backed, confident, surrounded by engineers and project leaders. Many faces were unfamiliar. Some had retired. Some had died. Some had simply vanished into history. Ethan stared at the photograph. Then a voice behind him spoke quietly. "You found it." He turned. Walter stood there, hands in his pockets, calm as ever. For several moments neither man spoke. Then Walter looked at the photograph. A faint smile touched his face. Not proud, not nostalgic. Something more complicated. "Good people," he said softly. Ethan glanced toward him. What happened to them? Walter studied the faces. The same thing that happens to everybody. His eyes lingered on the picture. Then he added, "Machines are easier." Ethan frowned. Easier than what? Walter's gaze never left the photograph. Keeping people together. For the first time, Ethan sensed a story hidden beneath the silence. A story nobody had fully told. And judging by the shadow that briefly crossed Walter's face, the hardest part of that story was still waiting to be uncovered. The conversation stayed with Ethan all night. Machines are easier, keeping people together. The words sounded simple, yet the longer he thought about them, the heavier they became. By sunrise, North River Manufacturing faced a crisis far larger than a broken production line. The company had lost 3 major contracts in 6 months. Competition overseas was growing. Operating costs were rising. Investors wanted immediate action, and immediate action usually meant the same thing: layoffs. The board meeting began at 9 o'clock. The atmosphere felt colder than usual. Numbers filled the presentation screens. Forecasts, margins, risk assessments. Every graph pointed downward. A board member adjusted his glasses. "We need structural changes." Another nodded. "Automation would reduce labor costs significantly." Someone else added, "We're carrying too much workforce for current demand." The words were professional, polished, but Ethan knew what they meant. Hundreds of workers, hundreds of families, hundreds of lives reduced to percentages on a spreadsheet. 6 months earlier, he might have agreed without hesitation. Now he wasn't so certain, because during the past week, he had discovered something uncomfortable. The company's greatest strength wasn't showing up on any report. And he couldn't stop thinking about the man nobody had noticed for years, Walter Briggs. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Walter sitting alone in the employee cafeteria. The lunch rush had ended. Only a few workers remained. Outside, snow melted beneath weak winter sunlight. Walter slowly stirred a cup of coffee. The motion seemed almost absent-minded. Ethan sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, just unfamiliar. Finally, Ethan asked, "Why didn't you take the promotions?" Walter smiled faintly. There was no surprise in his expression, as if he had expected the question eventually. "I did." Ethan frowned. "What?" "I accepted 2 of them." "You were management?" Walter nodded. "A long time ago." "Then why leave?" The old man stared into his coffee. For several seconds, only the distant hum of vending machines filled the room. Then he answered, "My wife got sick." The words landed softly. No drama, no performance, just truth. Ethan remained quiet. Walter continued. "Management meant longer hours, more travel, more meetings." His gaze lowered. "She needed me at home." The sentence ended there. Nothing more. No explanation was necessary. Some decisions never appeared in company records. Some sacrifices existed only inside families. Walter's fingers rested against the coffee cup. When she passed away, coming back here felt easier. To maintenance? Walter nodded. To people. That answer puzzled Ethan. Walter noticed. A small smile appeared. Titles disappear. He looked through the cafeteria window toward the factory floor. People remember who helped them. Over the following days, Ethan began noticing things he had previously missed. Tiny things. Invisible things. The kinds of details executives rarely saw. A supervisor struggling with a staffing problem stopped Walter for advice. A young technician asked him about an equipment issue. 2 departments arguing over responsibilities listened when Walter suggested a compromise. Again and again. The same pattern. Not authority, trust. Nobody obeyed Walter because they had to. They listened because they wanted to. Because somewhere over 40 years, he had earned something far more valuable than a title. Respect. And respect couldn't be purchased. It couldn't be assigned. It couldn't be printed on a business card. The true test arrived 3 weeks later. A major hydraulic failure threatened the company's largest production contract. If the issue wasn't solved quickly, North River could lose the account entirely. The pressure was immense. Engineers worked around the clock. Consultants were called in. Specialists reviewed data. Nobody found a solution. The atmosphere inside the factory tightened. People grew frustrated, exhausted, short-tempered. The contract represented hundreds of jobs. Everyone knew it. Late one evening, Ethan walked through Building C. Most offices were dark. Only emergency lights illuminated sections of the factory. The building felt enormous, quiet, waiting. Near the damaged system, he found Walter speaking with a group of younger employees. Not solving the problem himself, teaching, asking questions, encouraging them to think. One technician suggested an idea. Another improved it. A third identified a flaw. Gradually, the pieces began fitting together. Hours later, the team discovered the answer, not because Walter fixed it, because he guided them toward fixing it themselves. Standing nearby, Ethan suddenly understood something. For years, he had assumed Walter's value came from what he knew. That wasn't it. His value came from what he had passed on. Knowledge survived because he shared it. Confidence survived because he encouraged it. The company survived because people trusted each other. And that trust had been built one conversation at a time, over decades. The realization hit harder than any financial report. Walter's greatest achievement wasn't machinery, it was people. The contract was saved, production resumed, orders stabilized. The crisis passed. Spring eventually arrived. Snow disappeared. Rain returned. Then sunshine followed. Life moved forward, as it always did. A few months later, Walter announced his retirement. The news spread quickly through the factory. Yet the reaction surprised Ethan. Nobody organized a grand celebration. No extravagant ceremony appeared. No expensive farewell event. That wasn't Walter's style. Instead, workers arrived early on his final day, before sunrise, before the machines started. Before the normal noise of production filled the building, nearly everyone came. Engineers, technicians, operators, janitors, managers, people from every department. Many carried stories Walter had never told, stories about encouragement, advice, second chances, quiet acts of kindness, moments nobody else had witnessed. The gathering remained simple, exactly the way Walter wanted. When it ended, he collected a small cardboard box containing a few personal belongings, nothing more. 43 years reduced to a box that fit beneath one arm. As he walked toward the exit, Ethan accompanied him. Morning sunlight spilled through the entrance doors, warm, golden, different from the cold winter light that had filled the factory months earlier. Near the doorway, Walter suddenly stopped. A new brass plaque had been installed beside the entrance wall. He stared at it. For a long moment he said nothing. The inscription was simple. No titles, no rankings, no achievements. Only a few words. Built by many hands. Strengthened by one who never asked for credit. Walter slowly reached out. His fingertips brushed the metal. His eyes glistened slightly. Not from pride, from memory. Then he laughed softly. The quiet laugh of someone who understood that recognition had never been the point. Behind him, hundreds of workers stood silently, not because anyone told them to, because respect often required no instructions. Walter looked back one final time, at the machines, the people, the factory, the life he had helped build. Then he nodded, a small gesture, almost invisible, and stepped into the morning light. The doors closed gently behind him. Yet somehow the building didn't feel emptier, because the most important thing Walter left behind wasn't his knowledge, or his designs, or his years of service. It was the people carrying pieces of him forward. And for the first time, Ethan finally understood what leadership looked like. It wasn't standing above others. It was leaving them stronger after you were gone. And that was the one thing no report could ever measure. What remained after the footsteps faded? 3 months after Walter Briggs retired, the factory looked exactly the same, at least from the outside. The same parking lot, the same loading docks, the same steel buildings rising beside the river, the same shift changes at dawn and dusk. Life appeared unchanged. Yet inside North River Manufacturing, something had quietly transformed. Ethan noticed it first during a Monday morning operations meeting. A problem had emerged on one of the assembly lines. Not a major crisis, just the kind of issue that once would have triggered arguments between departments. In the past, engineering would blame production, production would blame maintenance, maintenance would blame outdated equipment. Hours would disappear while everyone protected their own territory. This time was different. Before Ethan could even intervene, representatives from 3 departments had already gathered around a table. Ideas were exchanged, mistakes were admitted, solutions were discussed. Nobody seemed interested in assigning blame. The problem was solved within 40 minutes. As the meeting ended, Ethan found himself smiling. Years earlier, he wouldn't have noticed the difference. Now he understood exactly what he was seeing. Walter, not physically, but everywhere else. His influence remained woven through the company like threads inside fabric. Invisible, yet holding everything together. One rainy afternoon, Ethan walked through Building C. The familiar sounds echoed through the factory. Hydraulic pumps, rotating motors, forklift alarms, compressed air. The building still felt alive. Near a maintenance station, he spotted Luis, the same technician who years ago had looked confused when Walter asked about machine vibrations. Now Luis was training 2 apprentices, patiently, carefully, explaining not just what to do. Ethan stopped nearby and listened. One apprentice made a mistake. Nothing serious, just an incorrect assumption about a sensor reading. The younger Ethan might have corrected him immediately. Luis didn't. Instead, he asked questions, guided him, allowed him to discover the answer himself. The exact method Walter had used. When the apprentices moved on, Ethan approached. "You've become a good teacher." Luis laughed. "I'm trying." Then his expression softened. Walter always said people remember what they figure out themselves. Ethan nodded. Another piece of the old man still moving through the building. Later that year, North River celebrated its 75th anniversary. The company planned a public event. Local officials attended. Community leaders arrived. Former employees returned. Large display boards showcased the factory's history. Photographs lined the walls. Machines from earlier decades were restored and exhibited. For weeks, teams prepared presentations about the company's achievements, its products, its innovations, its growth. On the morning of the event, Ethan arrived before everyone else. Workers were still setting up tables. Sunlight streamed through high windows. Dust floated through the beams of light. The atmosphere felt calm, almost reflective. As he wandered through the exhibits, one display caught his attention. It hadn't been created by management. Employees had organized it themselves. The title read, "People Who Built North River." The display wasn't filled with executives, or investors, or public figures. Instead, it contained photographs of welders, technicians, machine operators, janitors, and maintenance workers. People whose names rarely appeared in reports. People who had spent decades helping the company survive. Near the center stood a photograph of Walter, younger, standing beside one of his original machine designs. Below it was a handwritten note. No signature, just words. "He never made us feel small for not knowing something." Ethan stared at the message. Then another. "Whenever something broke, he fixed more than the machine." And another. "He taught me enough to believe I belonged here." There were dozens, perhaps hundreds. Small memories left by workers. Tiny moments. Individually insignificant. Together, extraordinary. For several minutes, Ethan simply stood there, reading, learning, understanding. Walter's true legacy had never been hidden. People had been carrying it all along. That evening, after the celebration ended, Ethan drove across town. The sun was setting. Golden light stretched across quiet streets. Children played basketball near sidewalks. Neighbors sat on porches. The world felt slower, away from the factory. Eventually, he reached a small house. Modest, well-maintained. A garden filled with flowers surrounded the front path. Walter opened the door before Ethan could knock. "You look lost." Ethan laughed. "I was nearby." "You were not." "No." Walter smiled. "Come in." The house felt warm. Photographs filled the walls. Family pictures. Old memories. Pieces of a life most factory workers had never seen. They sat on the back porch, overlooking the garden. For a while, they talked about ordinary things. Weather, fishing, retirement, nothing important. Yet somehow everything felt important. As daylight faded, Ethan finally spoke. "Do you miss it?" Walter looked toward the horizon. The answer took time. "I miss the people." Then he smiled. "But that's different from missing the job." Crickets began singing in the distance. A gentle breeze moved through the garden. For several moments, neither man spoke. The silence felt comfortable, the kind earned over time. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been sitting in his mind for months. Did you ever regret it? Walter glanced toward him. The promotions? Ethan nodded. The recognition? The opportunities? Any of it? Walter looked back toward the fading sunset. The answer arrived quietly. No. Walter shook his head. I got to watch people grow. A small smile appeared. I got to see scared young workers become confident. His eyes reflected the last light of day. I got to help where I could. Then he added, that's enough for one lifetime. Ethan lowered his gaze, because for the first time, he believed it. Not everyone measured success the same way. Some people built careers.